following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Welcome to Common Sense Living, the stepping stone to success. Common Sense Living, where common sense makes perfect sense. Think of Walt Disney. He didn't quit. That's common sense. Like Abraham Lincoln, turn your negatives into positives and your chaos into order. Patience, persistence, perspiration make an unbeatable combination for success. Welcome to Common Sense Living, where common sense makes perfect sense.
Welcome to Common Sense Living, where common sense always makes perfect sense. This is your host, Jose Luna, and we have been talking, all this time about the book of Daniel. But before we talk about that, I just want to tell you, this weather has been crazy, has been wacky. I mean, it was minus 11 at my place. I know some places was minus 18, minus 19, something like that, plus the windshield factor. And all of a sudden, overnight is 50 degrees, 51 degrees. That's quite interesting. I have never seen anything like that. But we have to talk about Daniel, not the weather, and that's what we are going to address today. And before, I just want to bring some people in about what we talked before. We talk about the covenant, God's covenant. We talk about the covenant having three parts, the land, the seed, and the co-rulership. And that covenant that God has made with mankind has been transferred from people to people. It's the same elements of the covenant were given to Adam, to Abraham, to David, King David, and anybody who has entered into a covenant with God. Even today, when we accept Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior, the covenant remains. It's still the same elements of the covenant. God has promised to give us a new earth. God has promised to make our seed or our descendants and ourselves to live forever. And God has promised us that we are going to be co-rulers with Him when we get into the new earth or when we go to heaven. Therefore, today, as we promised, we are going to be talking about those elements, but more in details, chapter by chapter, based on the book of Daniel. So let's begin with Daniel chapter 1. The date given in the first chapter is the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim. This third year is equivalent to the fourth year of the ruling of the same king. And you said, man, you lost me already. You lost me. You are saying it's the third year and it's equivalent to the fourth? That makes no sense. Well, let me put it to you this way. When we take classes, for example, when we take classes, we go to school, the school begins in September. And let's say September of 2015, and it runs through June 2016. That's one school year, but in reality it's two fiscal years, 2015 and 2016. The same thing, so nothing to panic about it. So this is what is called inclusive way of time reckoning. Inclusive reckoning, that's what it means. God Himself, according to what we can see on the screen, God Himself, according to verse 2, delivered the king of Judah into Nebuchadnezzar's hands. And this is a problem for a lot of people who don't understand this concept. How can God allow a pagan king to come and take over his king, the king of his people, to come and take over his people to be enslaved by someone who was no better by any means than Jehoiakim? Nebuchadnezzar was any better than Jehoiakim, by the way. But God chose Nebuchadnezzar, and the Bible specifically in Daniel chapter 2 it says, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, with some of the articles of the house of God, in which he carried into the land of Shinar, which is what today is called Iraq, to the house of his god. The god is Marduk, the chief god of the Babylonians. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. So Nebuchadnezzar comes into Jerusalem. He destroys Jerusalem. He destroys the temple. But before he put everything on fire and destroys everything, he takes all the utensils, all the gold that is, and the silver that is in the utensils that were used in the temple. He brought them into Babylon, and he put them in the temple of his God, which was Marduk. So, as we can see in the screen, Nebuchadnezzar takes part of the vessels from God's sanctuary and brings them into the temple of his God. Oftentimes, ancient conquerors took vessels from the temple of the conquered ones, and these vessels were brought to the temples of their own gods as trophies. So these are trophies. Therefore, what Nebuchadnezzar is doing is bringing trophies, tangible proof that he had, in his mind, he had conquered Jehovah, the Lord God of the Israelites. That's what he's thinking in his mind. And that's what most people really believe, because they believe that if you went and conquered a group of people that had a particular God, that meant that you had also conquered their God, because their God was not able to protect them. And that's why all the time, they brought tangible proof of these victories. Going to the screen, the conclusion of this is that people believe that the God of the conquered ones had been conquered also. Nebuchadnezzar will discover later on that he was completely wrong. He did not know that the God of the Hebrews was, and still is, the living God and Lord of Lords, the unconquerable. What we are saying right here is that Nebuchadnezzar, up to this point, he's a young guy. His father died. He was doing a war, besieging Jerusalem back in 606 BC, and then he heard the news that his father had died. He went and crossed the desert as fast as he could with the army that he had, went back to Babylon, what today is Iraq, about 60 miles down south from Baghdad, and he went back to Babylon to make sure that he would be crowned as king before anybody would try to attempt to take over the kingdom from him, because he was away. And that's the type of guy Nebuchadnezzar was. Very young guy, but very, very smart guy. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar was the individual who introduced the concept of diversity into his kingdom. And we will see that in a few minutes later on this chapter. Take a look at the screen. The king had eunuchs already, verse 3. These men were also slaves, the eunuchs, slaves brought into Babylon by the conquerings of the king. The Israelites were not supposed to become part of the slavery realm of Babylon if they would have been faithful to the covenant. Therefore, God allowed them to become slaves and eunuchs because of their infidelity. 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 18, it specifically says, you will be eunuchs in Babylon, which means men were castrated. But God prophesied this. He said, hey, if you don't change your ways, I will allow you to be slaves and become eunuchs in the court of Babylon. And that's exactly what happened. Let's take a look on the screen. The king commanded Ashpenaz to bring into the palace certain of the children. The Hebrew word is ben, which means descendants of Israel. The children are descendants of the royal seed, verse 3. They had to be young and tender, verse 4. And they had to have these characteristics. Number one, there could be no blemish on them. They had to be well-favored, skillful in all wisdom, cunning in knowledge, understood in science, and with the ability to stand in the king's palace. What Nebuchadnezzar is trying to do is, he wants the best of the best. He wants the smartest. He wants the brightest. He wants the most intelligent from every nation he conquered, and that's what he did. And he then brainwashed them in order for those people to serve Babylon, and that's how Babylon became Babylon, the Golden Empire. Let's go back into the screen. These are 6 main characteristics that any young person would like to have. Conclusion, the king wanted the best of the best for his own service. Also, the king appointed what they should eat. And I want to tell you about this. Any training in life, I mean true training, and any brainwashing begins with what you eat. You might disagree with me. It doesn't matter to me. You see, the first commandment that God gave Adam and Eve was, "Thou shalt not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil." Of every tree you can eat, but of this tree don't eat. Any sports person, I used to run 100 meters. I used to run 200 meters, and any training of that kind begins with what you eat. Begins with food. And Nebuchadnezzar had this very clear in his mind. So the first thing he did, he gave them a diet, a Babylonian diet. And when we talk about, going back into the screen, when we talk about what they should eat, what comes to your mind? Is not this a resemblance of Genesis 2:16? God's first commandment to man was about what he should eat and what not to eat. As God also wanted men to eat from the tree of life and to abstain from the fruit of the tree of evil, Nebuchadnezzar wanted that his pupils would eat from his own food. Conclusion, any training in life starts with food. So these 4 young men, what is happening is, Nebuchadnezzar started them in the path of being brainwashed. Now, there are 4 people in the court. I want to remind you that when Nebuchadnezzar invaded Jerusalem in 606 BC, history tells us that he took with him 10,000 people. 10,000 of these young men from the royalty. But from those 10,000, he got the best of the best. These 4 kids were the best of the best. And he brought them into palace. He changed their foods and something else, their diet, and something else he did. We will see. But let's talk about the number 4. These 4 young men, the number 4 in the Bible, represents the whole, the entire spectrum, according to Revelation chapter 7, verse 1. Conclusion, these 4 gentlemen, or young men, represented the whole nation of Israel in Nebuchadnezzar's palace. Now, I want you to take a look to the meaning of the names. Let me say this because I don't want people to go crazy here. Let me say this. Oftentimes in the Bible, when God is about to do something, he sends a hidden message through the names given to the people. And he gives those names in certain orders so that the message would be given in that order. Example, we find the angel Gabriel who appeared to Mary. He said, "And you shall call his name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins." And then, that's in Matthew chapter 1, verse 21. But in verse 23 of the same chapter, in the same book, Matthew chapter 1, verse 23, angel Gabriel said, "And they shall call his name Emmanuel," because, which means God is with us, which implies that he would first save the people from their sins, and once that would happen, then God would come and dwell with us or among us. And that's the concept. So let's take a look into the screen to see the meanings of their names in Hebrew. Daniel means God is my judge. Hananiah means the Lord has been gracious to me. Misael means he who comes from God. Azariah means the Lord is my helper. So what is the message involved in their names in the order given? Well, God has judged his people through all the way through. He has been gracious to them. They had to accept that this was part of God's design, which means coming from God, Misael. And he was going to help them in every situation, even during the exile, because Azariah means God is my help. So we can go crazy all over the places with that, but this is just for you an intellectual exercise for you to see that God many times hides messages even in the meaning of the names that are found in the Bible. More, Nebuchadnezzar changed their names into Babylonian names because, as I said, any training begins with food, and then that is going to change the way you think. But then what they do is changing the names is going to change your identity, because your name in Hebrew mindset meant your identity. Nebuchadnezzar changed their names into these Babylonian names. Belteshazzar. Daniel was called Belteshazzar, which means the depository of the treasures of Baal. Shadrach, which means God, the author of evil, be propitious to us. Propitious means be merciful to us. Meshach means he who belongs to the goddess Sheshach. And Abednego, which means the servant of Nego. What is the meaning of the message implied in their Babylonian names in the order given? Well, let's take a look. You are part of the treasure of the devil now. The author of evil will help you, because you belong to the goddess Mother Earth, not to God. In reality, you are slaves. And that is a very, very clever way of really brainwashing you. Changing your diet, which is going to change the way you process things. As a matter of fact, just incidentally, just to help you out with this, fast food restaurants began in 1960, at the end of 1960. They did a research in 1961 about fast food restaurants and violence, criminality in the U.S., all over the U.S. You know what the findings were? Well, I'm going to tell you. In that year, criminality triplicated about 67% more than the previous year, and they thought it was linked to fast food restaurants. That's quite interesting if you think about it. Their names were changed into Babylonian names in order to brainwash them. Going back to the screen, Daniel and his friends decided not to defile themselves with the food of the king. Daniel seems to eat meat in chapter 10, verse 3. The food was dedicated first to the Babylonian gods. And I want to say something here that is quite, is going to upset some people who believe that Daniel was vegan. There are some people, some religious people out there that say that because Daniel decided not to contaminate himself or defile himself with the food from Nebuchadnezzar's table, he was vegan. That's not what the text says. In fact, Daniel chapter 10 verse 3 says that he did not eat meat for 3 weeks. So the issue here is not he was vegan or not. The issue here was that any food, they would take food from Nebuchadnezzar's table and would feed these 4 guys and the other guys that were chosen also with this food. But any food that the king ate, before he would eat any of that food, they would come into a special sanctuary they had inside the palace, like a shrine. They would come in with the food, and they would offer this food to their gods, in this case to Marduk, because we know that Marduk was the chief god of Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar relied heavily on his belief on Marduk at that time. Therefore, going back to the screen, the matter involved here is something more than eating. It is fidelity to the covenant. It is faithfulness to the covenant, what is in reality involved. And Daniel seemed to be also the oldest one among the four, because he's the one who takes initiative, and the rest followed him. We know today that Daniel was probably 18 years old when he was brought to Babylon. And what happened is this. When this food that was offered to the gods now was given to them, the Hebrews said, we can't eat this food, man. I'm sorry, we can't. So they talked to the guy, and they told him, please don't bring us this food. We can't eat it. And the guy said, I'm a dead man if I don't follow the king's orders. And Daniel made a deal with this guy. He said, can you help us out here? Just give us 10 days. And if in 10 days, our bodies and our faces look kind of, weak and kind of whatever, not as good as the others, we will accept your terms. The guy said, okay, I'll make the deal. 10 days is not a long time. It's not enough to really make a case. It's okay. I'll give you that. And let's take a look. 10 days were given as a probationary time. The number 10 for the Babylonians meant the whole. It was used in the same sense as the number 7 among the Hebrews. What exactly Daniel and his friends were eating for 10 days that made them look different? Well, the Bible says they were eating seeds or grains such as barley, wheat, rye, peas, etc. But the most important thing for us today is to be healthy. And Daniel and his friends were found stronger and wiser than the rest of the students. This is what happened. At the end of the 10 days, the guy allowed them to continue eating their food. At the end of the course in the Babylonian University, Daniel and his friends were found 10 times wiser than any other of the kids that were there being brainwashed. I don't want you to get confused. They were given, Daniel asked for 10 days to see if they could be allowed to continue eating their peas, their rice, their seeds, their grains, their cashews, and that type of thing, figs, and that type of thing. Because they were able to pass the test, the guy from the kitchen allowed them to continue their diet. When they finished their course at the university, they were brought before Nebuchadnezzar to be tested by Nebuchadnezzar himself and his wise men. Daniel and his friends were found 10 times wiser than anybody else. And that's what we are talking about. So these aspects, going back to the screen, demonstrates God's ability to work with those who are faithful to the covenant. Obedience to the laws of nature are obedience to God's law. It's part of the covenant. God as a suzerain, which means the protector, rewarded with blessings Daniel's fidelity to the covenant. They were found 10 times better than the rest of the students. Again, the number 10 comes up. And finally, chapter 1 ends up saying, the last verse in chapter 1, I'm going to read it. And Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. Well, the last verse ends saying that continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. This means that the book was not begun to be written until the first year of this Persian king. In chapter 10, verse 1 says that in the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a theme was revealed unto Daniel. And we know today, when we do literary analysis, that Daniel chapter 10, 11, and 12 is a whole unit. It was written in one block. And if it's giving me the dates in Daniel chapter 1, verse 21, saying that Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus, and then in chapter 10, verse 1 tells me, in the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a theme was revealed unto Daniel. That means that the whole book was written between the first and the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia. So the book was not written at once, and it was not written in the beginning of Daniel's life, because verse 21 says that he continued until Cyrus. He would have not known who Cyrus was when he was 18 years old. Follow me on that? So that means that, the whole book was written in those 3 years. And going back to the screen, the book was written in a time period of 1 to 3 years, no more, not less. Around that specific time of the human history, Cyrus was about to sign a decree to lay on the foundations for the rebuilding of the only temple in the world where people worshipped the living and true God. Therefore, God wanted his people to know that he had been faithful all the way through the exile. And if anybody would like more details, you can write to me down on the screen, disciplesoftheword.org, and you can leave a message for me, and I can send you a paper about that, a exegetical paper, where I can prove with the Bible that these dates are correct. Wrapping this up, this is the whole point of this chapter 1. It was not, the issue in chapter 1 was not an issue of eating vegan or not, or being vegetarian or not. You would live better if you are vegan and vegetarian. No doubts about that. All right? However, we cannot use that description of the Bible as a conclusive proof that, everybody now who believes in God needs to also stop eating meat. If you eat your meat, I would highly recommend that you don't eat it. But I don't have any biblical proof to say, you cannot eat meat. Who says that? Based on what in the Bible? I mean, I'm telling you, I have never eaten meat myself. Right? But I cannot come and tell you, hey, you cannot eat meat based on what the Bible teaches. That's all baloney. Therefore, what I want to remind you is that this issue with food in Daniel chapter 1 had to do with the covenant. Daniel refused to eat any food that was first offered to idols, to false gods. This, in his mind, was an issue of being faithful to God's covenant. This was Common Sense Living, where common sense makes perfect sense. See you next time.
Patience, persistence, perspiration make an unbeatable combination for success. Welcome to Common Sense Living, where common sense makes perfect sense.